shame. And I love that old cross where the dearest and best for a world of lost sinners was slain. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown.
Hello, welcome to our Bible study. My name is Clint McElroy, and today we'll be in 1 Kings chapter 3. We will be meeting this morning at 10 a.m., so please join us if you can. Hope to see you there. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. We'll also be meeting at 9 a.m. for classes, so please join us for those as well. You're welcome to join us in the auditorium at 9 a.m. to watch this class on the large screen there. We want everyone to know we have these English Standard Version Bibles from the World Bible School available. If you'd care to have one, please contact our church office and we'll make arrangements to get you one. We have many on our sick list, and we hope that you will get our announcement sheet and make sure to remember these folks in your prayers. As is our custom, we want to remember the story of the two men on the road to Emmaus who were joined by a third man on the way. As they got to their destination, that third man revealed himself to be Jesus the Christ, risen from the dead, and quickly left their company. As they reflected on their time with him, they remembered that as he'd been with them, there had been a burning in their hearts. It's that burning that they had in their hearts that we hope to kindle in our own hearts as we draw closer to the Lord through a study of his word. We also want to remember the admonitions of Leviticus chapter 19, to be holy for the Lord our God is holy. And we want to remember the admonitions of the stories of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, not lending ourselves over to convenience sake to seek the Lord, but to do what the Lord commanded and to find what the Lord says through a study of his word, not by listening with itching ears to everyone who comes to us with his message from God. We must verify that those messages are true by comparing what is said to what we find in God's word. It's a hard study. It's one we'll talk more about in coming weeks as we actually study the story of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. So we'll forego any further discussion of it at this time. We will be studying 1 Kings chapter 3 today, which is the first real story of Solomon without David's influence as the living father with him. So I hope you will join us now as we enter into this study, that you will find a word of encouragement in it. 1 Kings chapter 3 from the English Standard Version. Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were sacrificing at the high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. Verse 3. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father, only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I shall give you." Verse 6. And Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude." Verse 9. Give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this your great people? Verse 10. It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this, and God said to him, Because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life, or riches, or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall rise after you. Verse 13. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. Verse 15. And Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Then he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. Verse 16. Then 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, O my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. Then on the 3rd day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth, and we were alone. There was no one else with us in the house. Only we 2 were in the house. Verse 19. And this woman's son died in the night, because she lay on him. And she arose at midnight, and took my son from beside me, while your servant slept, and laid him at her breast, and laid her dead son at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had borne. But the other woman said, No, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours. The first said, No, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine. Thus they spoke before the king. Verse 23. Then the king said, The one says, This is my son that is alive, and your son is dead. And the other says, No, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one. And the king said, Bring me a sword. So a sword was brought before the king. Verse 25. And the king said, Divide the living child in 2, and give half to the one and half to the other. Then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death. But the other said, He shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide him. Then the king answered and said, Give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother. Verse 28. And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. Okay, so last time we studied out of 1 Kings chapter 2, the story of the passing of David and how Solomon's reign was established by him going through and shedding the blood of many men who had stood in opposition to David in one way, form, or fashion. The story starts off with David's blessing for Solomon in the beginning of chapter 2, verse 1. When David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do, and wherever you turn, that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, If your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. So this was a great blessing to bestow on Solomon. It was a reminder that that blessing was not David's own blessing, but it was in fact God's blessing given to David and now being passed on to Solomon. And that promise would continue not only as it had for David, but also towards Solomon if he would keep the laws and commandments of the Lord, his rules and testimonies as it was written in the law of Moses. It's also interesting to recognize that David understood that he was about to go the way of all the earth. He understood that his life was coming to an end. Although God had made all these wonderful promises to him, his was a a temporary life, as all of our lives are. We only have a portion of time given to us for this existence, and in that time we need to avail ourselves of what the Lord has commanded us to do. Make peace with the Lord and serve Him and receive His blessings. That's what David did, and David was telling Solomon that he could do the same thing. Then the story takes an interesting turn, one that I'm disappointed in David in what he did here. I understand it, and I understand it was necessary, but it's still disappointing. But David tells Solomon in verse 5 and following that Joab had done him wrong, and that he wanted Solomon to remember that and take Joab to task for this and put him to death. Don't let him go down to the grave, to Sheol, without blood. He wanted him to suffer an untimely death. He did not want him to go peacefully from this life. And he told him to deal loyally with the sons of Barzillai in verse 7, the Gileadite. And we know that David had found favor with Barzillai as he had run from his son Absalom, and he reminds Solomon that this is the case. He wants them to be able to eat at his table as a reward for being loyal to him during that rebellion of David's son Absalom. And he reminds Solomon about Shimei, the son of Gera, who also had betrayed David to a lesser extent. During that same time period, he'd come out to meet David in the way and cursed him and said all kinds of terrible things about him, but David had not taken his life. He had spared him because he felt like that was a judgment from God, and he had no right to take issue with Shimei, doling it on, if you will, because he had done these things that were grievous to the Lord, and the situation he found himself in was a judgment from the Lord, which was an interesting perspective. His friends and the people that had supported him did not share that. They wanted to take Shimei's life, but David spared it. And when he returned to Jerusalem, Shimei came out and met him and begged his forgiveness, which David offered. But here we have that David remembered that thing that Shimei had done, and the lack of support that Shimei had showed David in his time of need. And he also wanted him not to go down to Sheol without blood being shed. He didn't want him to go peacefully from this life. So these things David asked of Solomon. And then in verse 10, David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. And the time that David reigned over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. So that's kind of a platitude. His kingdom was established, but firmly established is another thing altogether. And so we go on, not passing on the significance of the passage we just read, but we've kind of dwelt on it extensively already. And in verse 13, we end the story of Adonijah as he comes to Bathsheba and makes a request of Bathsheba, and Bathsheba acquiesces. And that's kind of strange given the situation that had existed between Adonijah and trying to claim the throne without David's providence, and she and Solomon having to basically flee to the king to beg his indulgence and remind him that the king had made Solomon the heir. So here we have Adonijah having been put in his place by David making Solomon king, now approaching Bathsheba and asking this favor. And we'll talk about why he might have done that after we talk about the favor. He asks that Abishag the Shunammite, the woman that had been selected to be David's nurse, the one who had lain in David's bosom or vice versa, to give David the heat from her body because his body was not able to sustain itself on its own in his age. This woman, who had been a virgin and served in this capacity, was known as this servant of David, and And Adonijah was asking Bathsheba to request of King Solomon that she be allowed to be his wife. And Bathsheba acquiesces to this. Again, she says, okay. Now, why would Adonijah want Abishag the Shunammite to be his wife? Now, surely she was a virgin, an attractive woman by the way the account is conveyed. She was someone who was apparently considered attractive, that she was an attractive young woman who served David in this very intimate capacity, yet without being known by him, no sexual contact between the two of them. So why would he ask for that? Well, that would lend some credence to a claim to the throne, that if he took this David's nursemaid as his wife, that he had some claim of authority. It's very loose, but it doesn't take a whole lot to instigate rebellion in the hearts of men. And I think Adonijah was that kind of person. The description of him from chapter 1 would lend to that notion. He was a conniving person who was trying to work an angle. So Bathsheba, for whatever reason, which I can't even begin to understand why she would do it, approaches King Solomon in verse 19 and makes this request on behalf of Adonijah. When approached, King Solomon says that he would give his mother anything she wants, in much the same way that Bathsheba had responded to Adonijah's approach to her, requesting her favor. But when she makes the request, he responds in a different way. He completely rejects the request and confronts her almost in a demeaning way by saying in verse 22, "And why do you ask Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him the kingdom also, for he is my older brother, and on his side are Abiathar the priest and Joab the son of Zeruiah." So he immediately understood the subtle, if you might call it subtle, I don't think it was subtle at all, the conniving aspect of this request from Adonijah. Adonijah had already had this support from key elements of the administration to make him king against the counsel and will of King David. And now he was angling for, again, more support for that very purpose. In Solomon's mind, he understood it that way. Then King Solomon swore by the Lord, saying in verse 23, "God do so to me, and more also, if this word does not cost Adonijah his life. Now therefore, as the Lord lives, who has established me and placed me on the throne of David my father, and who has made me a house, as he promised, Adonijah shall be put to death today." So King Solomon sent Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and he struck him down, and he died. I will forthwith refer to Benaiah as Benaiah and not Benaiah the son of Jehoiada. He had been warned, and he was taking the warnings to heart, even though David had not explicitly warned him about Adonijah. He had warned him about these rebellious people, and taking that warning to heart, he took to action to respond to Adonijah the way that he had promised to respond at the end of chapter 1. Adonijah had not sat still, had not been still, and just accepted his place as not being king. He wanted to take advantage, he wanted to reach out, and it cost him his life. Next, Abiathar the priest was to be addressed. So Solomon sent Abiathar away from the priesthood. He basically exiled him to his home because he had supported Adonijah in his rebellious attempt at the throne. So he sent him home, away from being the priest, the high priest for the people, and it says this was done, fulfilling the word of the Lord that he had spoken concerning the house of Eli and Shiloh. So, going on, in verse 28, Joab hears about what's going on, and I think he understood the writing was on the wall, so to speak, and he fled, and he took hold of the horns of the altar. And Solomon sent Benaiah and said, "Go strike him down." And there was an exchange between Benaiah and Joab, And Benaiah returned to the king, and Benaiah said, he said, if he lets go, he's going to be killed. And Solomon said, yes, go ahead and make that happen. So Benaiah went back and killed him, even though he would not take himself away from the horns of the altar. Then there's an explanation following that as to why this was necessary, because of the wrongs that Joab had done as the commander of the army of Israel against Abner and against Amasa, and the shadow that brought on David's administration. David had hated that, and again had asked that Solomon make sure that Joab not go down a natural death, but face blood because of what he had done. Then in verse 35, Benaiah was placed as the head of the army in place of Joab, and Zadok the priest was put in place of Abiathar. Then in verse 36, Shimei was summoned, and the king told Shimei to build a house in Jerusalem and do not go out from there, because if you ever do, if you ever cross the brook of Kidron, which was right outside Jerusalem, you know for certain that you shall die, and your blood will be on your own head. And Shimei was good with that, so he built himself a house and lived many days in Jerusalem. It says in verse 39, at the end of 3 years, two of Shimei's servants ran away to Achish son of Maacah, the king of Gath, which was where the Philistines had lived earlier, and may well have been a Philistine. And when Shimei heard of it, he went and took his servants back from Gath. And when he got back, Solomon summoned him and said, did I not make it clear that you were not to leave Jerusalem, and that if you did so, it would be at the price of your life? Then he called for Benaiah to take his life, and he did, and he died. And then the conclusion of chapter 2 is that the kingdom was then established in the hand of Solomon. So you could clearly say that this was a firm establishment of Solomon in power in Jerusalem. He was now king, undisputed, over Israel, both Israel and Judah. Going on into chapter 3, Solomon immediately made a marriage arrangement with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now, it's not clear that it was immediate, but it's the first thing that happens in chapter 3. Then it says that he brought her back to Jerusalem, or the city of David, and lived there until his own house was finished, and that the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem were finished as well. Now that took a long time, so that was no short amount of time, but it's spoken of here as if it's all happening right here before what continues to happen, which I don't believe is the actual situation here. What I think is happening is that they're explaining that this was who he married and where they lived, and then it continues with the storyline pretty much having left off at the end of chapter 2, that the people were sacrificing in the high places. Now this was before the time of Jeroboam, so the high places were where they worshipped at. They would go up to the high places and make sacrifices there, particularly at Gibeon, where the tabernacle was apparently set up, and all the implements of the tabernacle were housed there. So Solomon loved the Lord, it says in verse 3, and he would go up and make offerings there at that location. He would burn thousands of burnt offerings there at that altar. And it was there one time when he was making sacrifices there that he fell asleep, and in a dream the Lord appeared to him in verse 5 and said, "Ask what I shall give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart towards you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in, and your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people? So this is all in a dream, mind you. So nobody witnessed this. This is Solomon recounting what happened to him in a dream in Gibeon as he was there to make sacrifices to the Lord, apparently early on in his reign as king. He refers to himself as recently made king. He refers to himself as still a child, as someone who has no experience. And the Lord is offering him this blessing that I would anticipate would make sense to offer him at the early part of his reign as king. So those are the things that clue me in as to the time frame of this occurrence, as opposed to the first few verses there, or the first verse there, that refers to Solomon making a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So having said all that, in verse 10, it pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this, and God said to him, because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life, or riches, or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right. Behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been seen before you, and none like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. So this was God's promise to Solomon. Again, this is still in his dream. And it's a very interesting thing that God was pleased for this request, a request of understanding. And what is it that drives us to study the Lord's word but a desire for understanding? I believe the Lord will bless us as he blessed Solomon in our quest for more understanding as we study his word. And we won't be blessed like Solomon was blessed, which is another interesting thing here. Solomon was blessed to be the pinnacle. He was the penultimate wise person in all of the history of God's creation. No one before and no one after. There are very few and rare people who enjoy that status in any aspect of life, let alone wisdom. There is no other who enjoys it as a wise person. Solomon is that man. He's the wisest person who ever lived, either before him or after him or ever to be. There will not be another man as wise as Solomon. And that is an incredible, incredible blessing that the Lord blessed Solomon with. And not only did he bless Solomon with wisdom, but he blessed him with all the other things that he could have asked for and other men would likely have asked for. He blessed him with riches and honor, and no other king would see the kind of riches and honor that Solomon would experience. And it's so interesting. Scott's brought up some of the story of the descendants of Solomon on the Wednesday night studies, how they took all the wealth of the temple and their own wealth and gave it away to foreign kings to make deals with them, to make treaties with them, or an attempt to make treaties with them. Asa did this to try to preserve the kingdom because there was a threat that was felt. This was a terrible waste of the wealth of Israel. The wealth of Israel was unparalleled, and likely unparalleled in a similar way to Solomon's wisdom. I don't know that. I'm not clear that that's what God's saying here, but Solomon amassed incredible wealth, and we'll read about that more as we read through the rest of the story of Solomon. His wealth is bewildering in magnitude and source. We don't know where he got all of his wealth, but he managed to attain great, great wealth, and the Lord blessed him with this simply because he asked for understanding. What else do you need? What else do you need to motivate you to seek the Lord? The Lord will bless you not only with understanding, but he will bless you in every other way because you seek understanding. That's an incredible, incredible example here that we have in the life of Solomon that we should immediately take advantage of. Verse 15, and Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. It's kind of that trick shot you've seen in television shows or in other stories where you see these whole things, the whole passages of things that have occurred to the characters, and then they wake up and it was all a dream. Well, here we have it kind of playing out that way here. But Solomon's dream was different, because while it was a dream where the Lord appeared to Solomon, it was a dream that had roots in reality. It really did happen. It really was a request made from Solomon to the Lord, and the Lord's actual response was given to Solomon in this dream. So we see this happening. Now, I'm just going to say this right now because it's doing it in my head right now. I will from time to time probably say King David when I mean to say King Solomon. It's not because I'm trying to mislead you. It's because those names are in my head at the same time. They're both kings. They're both related. There's a lot of ties between David and Solomon and other aspects of Solomon's rule, and I will struggle with that all the way through the study of Solomon. But I hope that you will bear with me in that. I will try to correct them as I identify them in my editing, but I probably won't be 100%. So please bear with me in that. It says, continuing in verse 15, he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord and offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings and made a feast for all of his servants. So he came back to Jerusalem where the ark of the covenant was. David had brought the ark to Jerusalem and pitched a tent there. Now these events that have transpired here have corresponding elements in 2 Chronicles chapter 1. But this next part of the story is not in 2 Chronicles, and I think that's interesting. But here we have probably the most famous story of any king of Israel. I know a lot of the other stories, but most people, if you ask them about the two women and the children, they know the story of Solomon and these two women and the two children. It's a very famous story. If not the most famous story about the kings or a king of Israel, I don't know one that would be more famous. Now, the story of David and Goliath comes to mind, but David was not yet king when that happened. Solomon here is king, so this is the distinction I make there. But this is an incredible story of how God proves out the promise that he made to Solomon in his dream. So these two, it records it here as prostitutes in the English Standard Version, came to King Solomon and stood before him. One woman said, "Oh, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. Then on the third day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth, and we were alone. There was no one else with us in the house. Only we two were in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. And she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me while your servant slept, and laid him at her breast, and laid her dead son at my breast." So here we have this tragic story of a woman whose son died in the night. And I've heard a lot of criticisms of this woman in my life about how she should not have been sleeping next to the child, or this thing or the other thing. And, it kind of discounts the fact that the other woman was also sleeping next to her own child. So I don't fault this woman for sleeping next to her child, I don't fault this woman for having had her son die in the night. But what she did next, rising in the night to take her dead child and swap it out with the living child, that is just terrible. I cannot imagine a more terrible thing to do to anyone than to steal their child and leave them with the dead child that is your own, to take their child away from them. And whether this was done out of mourning for her own child or jealousy, or I just can't fathom that would ever be an option for a person to do. It's just a terrible, terrible thing. Continues in verse 21, "When I arose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had borne. But the other woman said, No, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours. The first said, No, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine. Thus they spoke before the king." So after her explanation, it looks like there was an argument right there in front of the king. Verse 22 is not a discussion they had after the events of that she's recounting in verse 21, but actually as they're standing before the king. The other woman said, "No, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours." And then she said back, "No, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine." So they're having this argument before the king. The king has no clue as to which one is telling the truth. They could both be telling the truth. Each one has a plausible story. The child died in the night. Who knows? But the king had a plan. In verse 23, the king said, "The one says, 'This is my son that is alive, and your son is dead.' And the other says, 'No, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one.' So the king said, 'Bring me a sword.' So a sword was brought before the king. It doesn't look like he necessarily took the sword or had anyone wielding the sword, but the sword was now present. Without a doubt, this force of nature was present in front of these women. And the king said, 'Divide the living child in two and give half to the one and half to the other.'" It sounds merciless. It sounds absolutely horrid. And the pinnacle of wisdom is found in this. The absurdity of this statement is part of the wisdom of it. The absurdity of the proclamation is part of how you discover the lie. And this, I think, is something that could be utilized more than it's done. Certainly, we've seen occasions where men have used this trick of logic to reveal the truth teller and the liar other than King Solomon. It's a powerful mechanism if you can remember to utilize it in the hour of need. And certainly, we need to give some consideration to some of the absurd things we hear claimed by our leaders, because there may be reasons why an absurdity is advocated for that are not necessarily apparent to us. That does not mean they should be executed. And the king had no intention of cutting this child in half. He knew that by doing this, the truth teller would be revealed. And sure enough, in verse 26, the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, "Oh, my lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death." The love of a mother was truly revealed through the contemplation of this absurd act that was suggested by the king. And the heart of the other woman was revealed as well. "He shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him." So it's rooted in jealousy that her child had died and the other woman's had not died. What a terrible, terrible thing to find. And, this was apparently two women. They had to have been friends and going through a pregnancy together by themselves, no matter what disposition they had been, if they had been widows or if they were in fact prostitutes, I don't know. But these two women who had borne through the pregnancy of these children and then had these children one with another, they had to have been nursemaids to one another through the births. I mean, they were there with one another, so they were likely there as the children were born. And to have one have this heart of deceitfulness, this heart of betrayal toward the other one and toward the child that had survived is just absolutely terrible. The king understood immediately the situation. He said, "Give the living child to the first woman and by no means put him to death. She is his mother." He recognized immediately what he sought to find out. The wisdom of God was demonstrated. And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered in verse 28, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. And oh, what a wonderful thing to have said about you, that the wisdom of God was in you to do justice. No matter what the measure of wisdom is that you have, use it for justice. Use it for good before the Lord, before men. Don't do evil with wisdom. Wisdom is a valuable, valuable thing that the Lord gives, obviously, in measured amounts to various people. So we should use that wisdom very carefully. Don't do things that are evil with wisdom. And it can be used for evil. So Don't use wisdom for evil things. Use our wisdom for good, for justice, for those things that are upright before the Lord. What a wonderful thing to have said about you. So Solomon certainly starts off his rule as king in this wonderful way, availing himself of the opportunity to request something from the Lord. And what did he request? He requested wisdom. And then he availed himself of the use of that wisdom to do justice before man. That's an incredible thing. What a wonderful thing to have said about you. I hope you found a word of encouragement in today's lesson. This is an incredible story of encouragement. It certainly is laced with terrible things that are awful and the consequence of which are awful, but it is wonderful that the Lord would bless anyone in such a way, and that that person in the blessing would use those things to do right before the Lord. We will be meeting today at 10 a.m., so please come if you can. Hope to see you there. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. God bless. Have a great week.